Hello folks, CRBox here. As some people mentioned, my last video didn't go deep enough into explaining the build. As requested, we will do a deep dive into the Enigma Lightning Blast build. The Runemaster is an incredibly versatile caster class that has many completely different viable playstyles. This particular build is strong because it generates a ton of ward with the right setup. It has amazing crowd control abilities in Snap Freeze, and by applying every single ailment available in the game, with the help of some gear. The full build also has incredible DR, with a flat 78% damage reduction stat on top of 175% added armor against shocked enemies. This makes this build perfect for pushing monoliths and arenas alike. We'll start off this guide by answering a few questions I got from the comments in my last Runemaster video. Then, we'll touch on how the build functions and how to play it properly. We will briefly talk about my leveling strategy with Lightning Blast, and then we'll take a look at the itemization in last Epoch and try to optimize our gear. And lastly, we'll talk about the best farming route and general progression strategy for Runemaster. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, the questions. Why is Runebolt in the planner if you don't use it? That's a great question. Although we specialize into the Runebolt tree, we don't actually slot it onto our action bar. Instead, we rely on the Frost Wall to cast Runebolts, giving us the Runeweave stacks we need, which exponentially increases our damage, thanks to this node. This next question is similar and asks how is it possible to cast Frostguard with my current setup? The way we make it work is by having Snap Freeze as my first ability in the action bar, granting us a cold rune. Then we spec into Frost Wall to convert it to fire. And finally, we convert Flame Ward into a frost spell, granting us our cold, fire, cold invocation required for the Frostguard shield. Here's the runic invocation skill tree, just in case you wanted to see it. For those who think the damage is low, it might seem weak from time to time because we rely on applying all those ailments and getting our buff stacks to get going. That being said, this type of damage scales incredibly well into the late game, since the longer we attack a target, the more damage we deal to it, up to a certain point. Now, onto how the build functions. How I like to run monoliths is by generating a nice buffer of ward at the beginning of the run, usually by casting Flame Ward to get an extra 50% retention. Then, you want to cast Frost Walls ahead of you to gain haste and frenzy as you move along. I usually cast Lightning Blast every other second if there's no mobs around, just to maintain a minimum of closed circuit stacks. In high density areas, you can cast Frost Walls at your feet to temporarily gain Frenzy and Runeweave stacks from the Runebolt being cast. You want to keep casting Lightning Blast to gain absurd amount of cast speed, crit, and ward. Ideally, you always want to have your Reowen Frostguard shield active, which you can cast by teleporting. Sometimes you can save your teleport if you know you'll need to get out of a bad situation, but in general, you want the shield active. Against most bosses, you can CC them with Snap Freeze, making most boss fights trivial. The damage is alright if you're allowed to stand still and cast, which you usually are. Against the Shade of Orbis, it's a little bit more tricky as he's immune to CC. You kinda have to know which spells are dangerous and which spells you can face tank. For any channeled ability or poison on the ground, usually you want to get out of there. When progressing through the campaign, I would only advise to level up Lightning Blast as your first spell if you wish to follow this build. You can freely experiment with the other slots. Personally, I went Teleport second for mobility and Runic Invocation third for AoE damage. I used the Lightning invocation called Sea of Sparks a lot during the campaign and early monoliths. This ability is very mana intensive, so in the mid game you can try to get some pieces with mana regen if you want. Once you fully transition to the end game build, you're gonna want to change those pieces out because you don't need any mana in the late game. I would recommend keeping all the helms you find with plus to Lightning Blast, as those can be very rare even in the end game. Runemasters are naturally very tanky, so you want to prioritize offensive upgrades, especially in the early game. I don't have much else to say for the leveling part, to be honest. I didn't follow a guide myself, I just recommend picking a skill and sticking to it for efficiency purposes, but feel free to experiment. Now, onto the itemization for the end game. Your highest stat priority should definitely be intelligence, as many different passives scale off this stat exponentially. Then, in that order, I would recommend cast speed, which increase your tankiness by converting more health into ward with the Twisted Heart, and then crit multiplier. You already have a lot of crit chance with passives, so you don't need a lot on gear. I'd also recommend getting Frailty and Armor Shred if possible. Defensively, you want to have ward retention as it gives you more room to move around without losing your ward. Hybrid health is also amazing, since you convert a percentage of your current health into ward with every spell cast, thanks to the Twisted Heart. It goes without saying that as you push higher and higher corruptions in arenas, you want your resistance maxed out. I personally try to build as tanky as possible, but this is a personal preference, I guess. Cooldown recovery is another great option, allowing you to teleport more often. Now, onto the unique priority. The two easiest to obtain are probably the Mad Alchemist Ladle and the Fragment of the Enigma. If you're part of the Merchant Guild, you can simply trade for those very early on, usually they sell for 0 gold. If you don't have access to trading, the Ladle drops from the Exiled Mages, and the Fragment of the Enigma commonly drops from the Stolen Lance Monolith. The Siphon of Anguish is also incredibly easy to get, whether you trade for it or not. It drops from the Shade of Orbis fairly commonly, so you'll most likely see a ton as you do monos. The next unique, the Strand of Souls, is an uncommon unique that drops from the Fall of the Outcast timeline, only in its empowered version. It'll drastically increase your ward retention, making it great for ward users. For that reason, a good one with over 60% ward retention will sell at 300,000 gold at the current market prices. Then, for the unique that will truly take your build to the next level, we have the Twisted Heart of Ukeros. If possible, you want one with good cast speed and at least 7% current health to ward on cast. I must warn you that without Spell Leech, this item won't improve your character much. I will touch on the best moment to get Twisted Heart later. The last unique I could recommend is Static Shell. I personally switched to it from a tier 7 Exalted Tyrant Regalia after I found one with 2 LP and rolled basically perfect stats. This lowered my DPS in the tooltip by quite a bit, but I believe it makes up for it in other ways. Now that we've seen the uniques and what they offer, let's visit the Merchants Guild to find out what bases make the best Exalted items for this build. For the chest piece, we have the Tyrant Regalia. This isn't really up for debate, it is by far superior to anything else. The raw damage gained just from the implicits is massive. You want to go for Intellect as the Exalted mod, if possible. You want to make sure you're looking at the implicits when judging an item like that. Both the increased cast speed and plus spell damage go up to 14 with this item. Next we have the Brass Amulet. It gives increased cast speed. That is a fairly obvious choice, but if you need specific resistances, I guess you could choose something else. Now for rings, we have one obvious choice, the Opal ring, but also the Ivory ring. I personally use one because I couldn't find any good opals. The Ivory ring gives ward threshold, so it's not as good for sure, but it is something. Special mention to the Invoker's Static Touch. I use that leveling up. It gives a ton of flat lightning damage. Really good. For the helmets, the obvious winner is the Arcane Visage for the cooldown reduction, but personally I couldn't find a good one, so I'm using a Celestial Helm for the crit chance, I guess. The most important thing is definitely the plus to Lightning Blast level on it. Tier 7 can go up to plus 4, but as you can see it costs up to $10 million right now. I feel like the helm and the chest are really the central late game pieces. Every time I see a Monolith Echo that has a chance to drop an Exalted Helm, I always go for them. Now for boots. You want to go for Citadel boots to get reduced damage from critical strikes. You could also go for Arcane boots for ward threshold, or if you really value haste speed, you could go for Vanguard boots. I feel like there's a ton of uniques with LP that could be good in this scenario, but I'll leave that for another time. For gloves, you really want to go Ascetic Glove for the increased cooldown recovery speed. If you really need more damage, I guess you could go for Solarium Bracers, but I wouldn't recommend it as crit chance doesn't have the most impact. There we are, folks. Before concluding, I wanted to quickly touch on the best course of action to get your character to the late game. I would recommend focusing on unlocking your blessings initially. You should get the Black Sun blessing first, as this will allow you to sustain yourself if you have the Twisted Heart. If you don't have the relic already, then it's not as pressing, but you'll still need it at some point. It doesn't need to be perfect. Then I'd farm the Reign of Dragon and get the plus to all res blessing. After that, you could get the other blessings, like the Lagan plus lightning damage, or push the corruption on the Reign of Dragon timeline first. After you get the Twisted Heart, Fragment of the Enigma, and the Mad Alchemist Ladle, the build is operational and ready to push. So this concludes my guide. I hope this was informative and that you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like the content. I plan on making more videos in the future. Here's some gameplay footage of the build in action. I'll see you around.
Trying to protect him. Fools.
fools.